The wind was a thief. It stole the warmth from the morning sun, the moisture from the cracked earth, and the last of the hope from Vashti's heart. It rattled the loose shutter on the cabin's only window, a sound like a dry throat trying to cough. 6 mouths to feed, and the flour sack was as empty as a promise from her husband. Her own stomach was a tight, aching knot, a feeling she had grown used to. It was the hunger in her children's eyes that she could not bear. Caleb, at 12, tried to carry the weight of being the man of the house, his shoulders already slumping under the load. He had been out since dawn, checking the snares that had yielded nothing but dust for a week. Leah, 2 years younger, was inside, humming a tuneless song to 4-year-old Ben, trying to distract him from the gnawing in his belly. Daniel and Miriam were huddled on the porch, their backs to the wind, scratching patterns in the dirt with sticks. They were drawing pictures of food. Loaves of bread, round apples, a chicken with fat legs. Jacob had left 3 months ago. He had walked out with the rising sun, promising he would find work in the next town, that he would send money. He'd taken their only good horse and the last of their savings. Vashti knew then, in the pit of her soul, that he was not coming back. He had looked at the harsh land, the 5 children, the endless work, and he had chosen freedom. He had left them with a half-plowed field, a leaky roof, and the dregs of their supplies. He had left her with 6 mouths to feed, counting her own. She stood by the cold hearth, one hand resting on the rough stone. Her gaze went to the small wooden box on the mantelpiece. Inside were the seeds her father had given her, seeds for herbs he had taught her to use. Sage for fevers, yarrow for wounds, chamomile to soothe a troubled sleep. He had taught her to read the land as well as she could read a book, to find water, to know which plants were poison and which were pantry. But even her father's knowledge could not conjure a rabbit out of thin air or make corn grow in a field of stone and sorrow. The cabin was a testament to broken dreams. Jacob had built it with grand talk of a dynasty, of a ranch that would stretch to the horizon, but his ambition was a fire that burned hot and fast, leaving only ash. He had not set the foundation stones deep enough. He had used green wood for the walls. He had started a dozen projects and finished none. Now, the wind found every crack a constant, whining reminder of his failure, of failure for choosing him. Mama? Leah's voice was small from the corner. Ben's crying again. He says his tummy hurts. Vashti turned, her face a careful mask of calm she did not feel. She walked over and scooped the small boy into her arms. He was too light. All the children were too light. His small body trembled with weak sobs. She held him close, rocking him gently, the movement automatic. Shh. Little one, it's all right. Mama's here. She looked at Leah, whose eyes were old with worry. Put a little more water in the pot. We'll have some broth. The broth was a lie. It was hot water with a pinch of salt, the last of it. But the warmth might trick their stomachs for a little while. As she moved toward the stove, a movement on the horizon caught her eye. A rider. He was not on the main track that led to town, but cutting across the open prairie, moving with a steady, unhurried pace that spoke of a man who knew the land and his place in it. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her hunger. Strangers were rarely good news. They were land agents with legal papers she could not fight, or drifters looking for a handout she could not give, or worse. She set Ben down, her hand finding his small shoulder. Leah, take the little ones inside, now. The children scattered like quail, disappearing into the dark interior of the cabin. Caleb had returned, empty-handed as she knew he would be, and now stood beside her on the porch, his young face set in a defiant scowl. He held a heavy stick like a rifle. Vashti put a hand on his arm, a silent command. The rider grew closer. He was a big man on a big horse, a deep bay that moved with powerful grace. He wore a dark coat, dust-covered and practical, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He did not look like a drifter. He looked like he owned the ground he rode over. He reined in his horse a dozen yards from the cabin, his gaze taking in the dilapidated fence, the fallow field, the woman and the boy standing guard on the porch. For a long moment he just sat there, surveying the scene. Vashti could not see his eyes, but she felt his stare like a physical weight. It was not a leering look or a pitying one. It was assessing. He was taking stock of her home, of her poverty. She lifted her chin, refusing to be shamed. This was her life. It was hard, but it was hers. Finally, he swung down from the saddle. The movement was fluid, economical. He did not drop the reins. The horse stood, ground hitched, a sign of perfect training. As he walked toward them, the dust from his boots puffed up in little clouds. He stopped at the broken gate of what was meant to be a yard. He took off his hat, and she saw his face for the first time. It was a hard face, carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded them. His hair was dark, shot with threads of gray at the temples. Lines were etched around his eyes and mouth, lines of labor and loss. But his eyes, they were a clear, startling gray, and they held a deep, quiet sorrow that seemed at odds with the power in his frame. He was not a young man, but he was far from old. He was a man who had lived, and lived hard. "Mom," he said. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly. "My name is Emmett. I'm from the Cross Creek Ranch. I was tracking a stray steer. Didn't mean to trespass." Vashti's heart hammered against her ribs. The Cross Creek. Everyone knew the Cross Creek. It was the largest ranch in the territory, a kingdom of cattle and grass that stretched for 50 miles. And this man, Emmett, was its king. She had heard his name whispered in town, a name spoken with a mixture of respect and fear. A man who had built an empire from nothing. A man who had lost his wife and child years ago and had since sealed himself away from the world. "You're not trespassing," she said, her voice tight. "This land is not much to trespass on." His gray eyes flickered from her face to Caleb, then to the cabin door, where the smaller children were peeking out. He seemed to understand everything in a single, sweeping glance. The hunger, the fear, the brittle pride that was her only armor. He looked back at her, and for an instant she saw something in his eyes that was not assessment. It was recognition, the quiet kinship of the wounded. "I see," he said softly. He gestured with his hat back the way he had come. "My men are making camp a few miles east by the river. We have supplies." He paused, as if choosing his words with immense care. "More than we need. It would be a waste to haul it all back." It was charity, offered in the thin disguise of convenience. Her pride screamed at her to refuse it, to tell this powerful man that they were fine, that they did not need his pity or his handouts. But then she thought of Ben's weak cries, of Leah's old young face, of the pictures of food drawn in the dust. Her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her children's lives were not. She swallowed, the motion painful in her dry throat. "We have nothing to trade," she said, the words costing her more than he could ever know. Emmett's gaze did not waver. He put his hat back on, shadowing his face once more. "I'm not asking for trade, Mom." He turned and walked back to his horse. From a heavy saddlebag, he unstrapped a large canvas sack and a smaller, heavier one. He carried them back to the gate and set them down just inside the broken fence line. The clatter from the smaller bag was unmistakable. It was coffee, sugar, salt. The larger one smelled faintly of flour. "There's bacon and beans in the too," he said, his voice gruff, as if he were embarrassed. "My cook is a fool, always packs for an army." He did not wait for her thanks. He did not linger. He simply mounted his horse, gave a curt nod, and rode away, disappearing over the rise as quietly as he had appeared. Vashti stood frozen, staring at the sacks. It was more food than they had seen in months. Enough to last weeks, maybe a month if she was careful. Caleb ran to the gate and peered into the larger sack. "Mama," he breathed, his voice filled with an awe that broke her heart. "It's flour and bacon." Tears she had refused to shed for her husband, for her broken dreams, for her own aching hunger now burned in her eyes. She walked to the gate and knelt, her hand resting on the rough canvas of the sack. It was real. A stranger had ridden out of the empty prairie, looked into the heart of her desperation, and offered a kindness so profound and so simple that it undid her. He had not asked for anything. He had not preached or pitied. He had just seen a need, and he had met it. He had fed them all that night, for the first time in a long time. The cabin was filled not with the sound of the wind or of crying, but with the smell of baking bread and the quiet sounds of children eating there. Phil and Vashti, watching them, felt the first fragile seed of a feeling she had thought long dead: hope. The days that followed were transformed. The constant grinding edge of hunger was gone, replaced by the quiet security of a full larder. Vashti baked bread, the scent filling the small cabin and chasing away the ghosts of poverty. She made thick stews with the beans and bacon, and the children began to regain their strength. The color returned to their cheeks. Laughter, a sound she had almost forgotten, began to bubble up between them. Ben no longer cried from a sore tummy, he played. Vashti did not allow herself to think too much about the man who had brought this change, Emmett. She said his name to herself sometimes, a quiet whisper in the dark. He was a force of nature. It's like a sudden rain that saves a dying crop. You were grateful for it, but you did not expect it to last. She told herself he had been passing through, that his act of kindness was a whim, a single, unrepeatable moment. She worked to make the supplies last, hoarding them like a miser, because she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that they would have to last forever. She spent her days trying to wrestle a life from the unforgiving land. With her body fueled by proper food, she found a new strength. She repaired the worst of the leaks in the roof with mud and grass. She used Jacob's abandoned tools to shore up the sagging porch, and she turned her attention to the small plot of land behind the cabin. It was rocky and hard, but her father had taught her that no land was hopeless. She spent hours clearing stones, her hands growing raw, her back aching. She would plant the herb seeds. It was not much, but it was a start. It was a claim. A week after his first visit, as a storm was gathering in the west, she saw him again. The sky was a bruised purple, and the wind had a sharp, cold bite to it. She had been gathering the last of the dry wood she could find, her arms full, when she saw him ride over the Samras. This time he was not alone. Two of his ranch hands were with him, leading pack mules laden with supplies. Her heart did a strange, complicated jump in her chest. It was not fear this time, but a jumble of gratitude, apprehension, and something else she refused to name. She stood straight, watching him approach. He rode directly to her, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Ma'am," Emmett said, his voice cutting through the rising wind. He gestured to the dark clouds. "This is a bad one coming, a norther. It'll bring hail, maybe flash floods in the low ground." His gray eyes scanned her small, vulnerable cabin. "You're not safe here. The roof won't hold against heavy hail." She clutched the wood tighter. "We'll manage." "No," he said, and the word was not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, stripped of all argument. "You won't." He looked at her, and his gaze was intense. "My men are driving a small part of the herd this way. There's a box canyon 2 miles north of here, sheltered on 3 sides. We can hold them there until the storm passes." He paused. "But I can't leave you and your children out in this." Before she could protest, a thought struck her. A memory of her father pointing out landmarks. A box canyon. She knew the one he meant. But she also knew something else. "The entrance is narrow," she said, thinking aloud. "But the back wall, there's a place. A washout from the spring rains years ago. It's not stable. If the flood is strong enough, that wall will give way. It'll be a trap, not a shelter." Emmett went still. His eyes narrowed, studying her. One of his men, a grizzled old cowboy, spoke up. "Mr. Emmett, we've used that canyon before. It's always held." "The storms haven't been this bad," Vashti insisted, finding a courage she didn't know she possessed. She was speaking to the most powerful man in the territory, contradicting him in front of his men. But she knew this small patch of earth. She knew its secrets and its dangers. The ground is too dry. The water won't soak in. It will run, and it will run with force. That back wall is sandstone and shale. It will crumble. Emmett looked from her face to the angry sky, then back again. He seemed to be weighing her words, not against his own knowledge, but against the certainty in her voice. He saw not a hysterical woman, but someone who knew, someone who belonged to this land in a way his men, for all their experience, did not. "Is there another place?" he asked, his voice quiet for her alone. Yes, she said without hesitation. A mile east of there, a series of bluffs with deep overhangs. The ground is higher, and the rock is granite. The animals won't be penned in, but they'll be sheltered from the worst of the hail. My father called it the stone eyebrow. He stared at her for a long, silent moment. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face. And she pushed it back, her chin held high. She had said her piece. The decision was his. The lives of his cattle, the safety of his men, rested on whether he would trust the word of a destitute woman in a falling down cabin. Jed, Emmett said, turning to the older man. Take the herd to the bluffs she's talking about. Move them now. The cowboy's eyes widened in surprise, but he did not argue. He simply nodded. Yes, sir, Mr. Emmett. He and the other man turned their horses and rode off at a gallop. Emmett turned back to Vashti. The first drops of cold rain were beginning to fall. The mules have lumber and tools, and more supplies. My men can fix your roof. Strengthen the walls, if you'll let them. This was her proving. Not just that she knew the land, but that she could accept help. That she could let him into her broken world. She looked at the cabin, then at the faces of her children pressed against the window pane. She could not protect them with pride alone. Yes, she said, his voice almost lost in the wind. Thank you. He only nodded, a curt, sharp gesture. But in his eyes, she saw it again. Not pity, respect. He saw her not as a charity case, but as an equal. A woman who had just saved him a fortune in cattle. A woman whose quiet strength was a force to be reckoned with. As his men got to work, their hammers echoing in the tense air before the storm, Emmett stood by her porch, not speaking, just watching the sky. And for the first time, Vashti did not feel entirely alone against the storm. She felt as though she was standing beside a mountain. The storm broke with a fury that seemed bent on tearing the world apart. Hailstones the size of acorns hammered against the newly reinforced roof, the sound a deafening roar. But it held. Emmett's men had worked with a swift, brutal efficiency, their hammers a frantic percussion against the rising wind. They had secured the shutters, patched the walls, and stretched a heavy canvas over the worst section of the roof, anchoring it with thick ropes. Then, at a command from Emmett, they had ridden off to join the herd at the bluffs, but Emmett had stayed. He said it was to make sure the roof held, but Vashti knew it was more than that. He stood by the window, a dark, silent silhouette against the violent gray light, watching the deluge. The children were huddled together by the hearth, where a small, cheerful fire crackled. They were awed by the storm, but not afraid. Not with him there. He was a bulwark against the chaos, his presence filling the small cabin with a sense of safety it had never known. Vashti moved about the room, her hands needing to be busy. She made coffee, the rich smell mingling with the scent of rain and wood smoke. She poured a cup and held it out to him. Mr. Emmett. He turned, seeming to pull himself back from a great distance. He took the cup, his large, calloused fingers brushing against hers. A jolt, small but sharp, went through her. It was the first time they had touched. His hands were work-ruined and strong, the hands of a man who built things, who held things. Her own hands, though chapped and scraped from her labor, felt small and fragile in comparison. Thank you, Vashti, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded different in his mouth. Not the sharp, impatient sound Jacob had made of it, but something softer, rounder, something solid. You should call me Mrs. Miller, she corrected quietly, though the name felt like a borrowed coat that no longer fit. His gray eyes met hers over the rim of the cup. Your husband is gone. It was not a question. Yes. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with all the things she would not say. The neglect, the cruelty, the final abandonment. He did not press. He simply nodded and turned back to the window. They stood in silence for a long time. The only sounds the roar of the storm and the crackle of the fire. It was a comfortable silence, not an awkward one. A silence of two people who understood hardship and did not need to fill the air with useless words. The storm passed as dusk fell, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. A rainbow, faint and trembling, arched across the eastern sky. Emmett announced he had to check on his men and the herd. Vashti walked him to the door. The back wall of that canyon, he said. Pausing on the porch, I sent Jed to check it after the worst of the rain. You were right. It collapsed. The whole canyon floor is a river of mud and rock. You saved my herd and my men. She looked down at her worn boots, uncomfortable with the weight of his gratitude. I just knew the land. That's more than most know, he said. He looked at her, his face serious in the fading light. I'll be back tomorrow to check the roof and to bring some things. This was the beginning of the slow burn, the quiet weaving of his life into hers. He started coming by every few days, always with a reason. A fence post needed setting. A gate was loose. He brought a milk cow one day, a gentle Jersey with soft brown eyes, saying she was a poor producer and he had no use for her. But the cow gave more milk than Vashti and the children could drink, and soon she was churning butter and making cheese. He never came empty-handed. He would bring a sack of potatoes, a string of onions, a side of beef, always with the gruff explanation that they had a surplus at the ranch. He was clothing his charity in practicality, trying to preserve her dignity, and she, in turn, found ways to repay him. She would mend his shirts, sewing the buttons on with neat, tiny stitches. She saved him a plate of hot stew when he worked late, fixing her corral, leaving it on the porch rail for him to find. One afternoon, he found her in her small herb garden. She was on her knees, her hands deep in the dark, damp earth, carefully transplanting the delicate seedlings. He watched her for a long time from the line before speaking. What are you planting? He asked. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. Herbs. For healing. My father was a doctor, of a sort. He taught me. He walked over and knelt beside her, his large frame looking out of place amongst the fragile green shoots. He picked up a clod of dirt, crumbling it in his fingers. This is hard soil. It needs work, she agreed, but it will yield in time. He looked at her hands covered in dirt. You are not afraid of work. Work is honest, she said simply. It gives back what you put in. Not like some people. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. She had not meant to say it. Emmett's face softened. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently move a stray leaf from one of the seedlings. The gesture was so tender, so careful, it made her breath catch. He understood. He understood the betrayal that went deeper than poverty. The children began to orbit him like small planets around a sun. He was a figure of quiet strength and absolute consistency, things their own father had never been. He showed Caleb how to properly set a snare, how to read the tracks of a deer. He carved a small wooden bird for Miriam, its wings so delicate they looked as if they could fly. He would let Ben sit on his knee and listen to the ticking of his pocket watch. He never tried to replace their father. He was simply Emmett, a solid, immovable presence in their shifting world. One evening, he stayed for supper. It was an unspoken invitation. She had simply set a seventh place at the rough-hewn table. He sat down without comment, bowing his head with the children as Caleb said a simple, halting grace. The meal was quiet but full, full of the sounds of a family. After the children were in bed, they sat on the porch together, watching the stars prick the vast, dark blanket of the sky. You've done a lot with this place, he said into the darkness. You've done a lot, she countered softly. The roof, the corral, the cow. A man needs to fix what's broken, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he tried to hide. She knew he was not just talking about her fence. He was talking about the world, about his own life. She knew the stories about him now, gleaned from the delivery man who brought supplies to the ranch store. She knew about his wife, Eleanor, who had died in childbirth, and the infant son Samuel, who had followed her a week later. They said he had not spoken his son's name since. They said he had poured all his grief and rage into building his ranch, his heart walled off behind a fortress of work and wealth. She looked at his profile, silhouetted against the starshine. She saw the powerful rancher, the man whose word was law in this territory. But she also saw the broken man, the one who carried a sorrow so deep it had carved itself into his face, and her heart ached for him, an echo of her own pain. He turned to look at her, and in the faint light she could see the turmoil in his eyes. He wanted to say something. The air between them was thick with it, a current of unspoken feeling that was both terrifying and wonderful. He leaned forward slightly, his hand lifting as if to touch her cheek. But then a coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, mournful sound. The moment broke. He drew back. His hand at his throat. He cleared his throat and stood up abruptly. "It's late. I should go." He left without another word. Riding off into the night, Vashti stayed on the porch for a long time, one hand pressed to her chest, where her heart was beating a wild, unfamiliar rhythm. She was falling for him. Despite every reason not to, despite the chasm between their worlds, she was falling for this damaged, decent man. And the thought terrified her more than any storm. The season turned. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The small patch of dirt behind the cabin was now a thriving herb garden, a testament to Vashti's persistent care. The children were healthy, their days filled with schoolwork she taught them from the few books she owned, and chores that gave them a sense of purpose. The cabin, once a symbol of failure, was beginning to feel like a home, patched and sturdy, filled with the smells of baking and the sound of life. Emmett's presence had become a steady rhythm in their lives. He no longer needed the pretense of a broken fence or a stray cow. He came because he wanted to. He would share their simple supper, his quiet presence a comfort at the head of the table. He would talk with Caleb about the ranch, treating the boy's opinions with a seriousness that made him stand taller. He would listen to Leah read aloud, his gaze soft with an emotion Vashti was beginning to recognize as affection. The slow burn between them intensified, a fire banked low but radiating a palpable heat. It lived in the small gestures. The way he would place a hand on the small of her back to guide her through a doorway, a touch that was both respectful and possessive, sending a shiver through her entire body. The time she found him asleep in the chair by the fire, his face unguarded and vulnerable in the flickering light, and she had gently draped a blanket over him. Her fingers hesitating for a moment near his cheek, they worked side by side, rebuilding the chicken coop, their hands brushing as they reached for the same tool, their eyes meeting and holding for a heartbeat too long. He was teaching her to trust again. Not just to trust him, but to trust that kindness could exist without a price tag, and she, in turn, was teaching him to feel. She saw it in the way his face would lose its harsh lines when he smiled at one of the children. She heard it in the way he started talking about the ranch, not as a business, but as a legacy. He was slowly emerging from the fortress of his grief, drawn out by the warmth of her small, bustling family. The town had noticed. On her rare trips for supplies she could not make or grow herself, she felt the whispers. The women would stop talking when she entered the mercantile, their eyes following her with a mixture of curiosity and censure. Vashti Miller, the abandoned wife, living on the charity of the great Emmett of the Cross Creek, they saw a scandal, a disgrace. They could not see the quiet dignity of two lonely people finding solace in each other's company. One afternoon, a buggy came up the track to her cabin. It was not Emmett, it was Mrs. Petty, the wife of the town's most prominent banker, and the self-appointed guardian of its morality. She was a woman built of sharp angles and disapproval. "Mrs. Miller," she said, remaining in her buggy as if the very ground of Vashti's homestead might contaminate her. "The good people of redemption are concerned." Vashti stood on her porch, her hands wrapped in her apron, her spine straight. "Concerned about what?" "Mrs. Petty, about the situation here, about your children. It is not proper, a woman alone with her children, accepting such frequent visits from a man like Mr. Emmett, a man of his standing." "Mr. Emmett has been a good friend," Vashti said, her voice dangerously calm. "He has helped us. There is nothing improper about it." "Friendship?" Mrs. Petty sniffed. A sound like a cork being pulled from a bottle of vinegar. "People are talking. They are saying he has installed you here, that you are his creature. It reflects poorly on him, and it sets a terrible example for your children." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "For your own good, and for the sake of his reputation, you must tell him to stop coming. It is the only decent thing to do." Rage, cold and pure. washed through Vashti. This woman, in her fine clothes and her smug certainty, dared to judge her, dared to twist an act of kindness into something sordid and ugly. My decency, Vashti said, her voice trembling slightly, is not for you or anyone else in town to measure. Mr. Emmett is an honorable man. It is your minds that are indecent, Mrs. Petty gasped, her face flushing a blotchy red. Well, I was only trying to warn you. You will find yourself an outcast. No respectable person will associate with you. Then I will content myself with the company of the unrespectable, Vashti shot back. With a furious flick of the reins, Mrs. Petty turned her buggy around and rattled away, leaving a cloud of righteous dust in her wake. Vashti stood shaking on the porch, the encounter leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. She had known the town was watching, but she hadn't realized the depth of their malice. They wanted to tear down what she was so carefully building. They wanted to punish her for surviving, for finding a sliver of happiness in the ruins of her life. That night, when Emmett arrived, he found her quiet and withdrawn. He sensed her distress immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his gray eyes searching her face. She told him about Mrs. Petty's visit, the words tumbling out in a rush of anger and hurt. When she was finished, she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "She is right about one thing," Vashti whispered. "This is hurting your reputation. People are talking." Emmett was silent for a long moment. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "Let them talk," he said, his voice a low growl. "Their words are wind. They mean nothing." He looked at her, his grip tightening slightly. "Do you want me to stop coming?" "Vashti?" The question hung between them, heavy and real. Her mind screamed that she should say yes, that she should protect him, that she should send him away before the town's poison tainted him. But her heart, her foolish, stubborn heart, could not form the word. "No." She breathed the single word, a confession. "I don't want you to stop." He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good," he said, "because I can't." But the threat was no longer just whispers. It was taking shape, and it was not coming from the town. It was riding up the track a few days later, a slouch-shouldered figure on a tired-looking horse. A figure Vashti knew with a sickening dread. It was Jacob. He reined in his horse and grinned, a wide, lazy smile that did not reach his eyes. He looked around, taking in the repaired fence, the sturdy coop, the milk cow grazing peacefully. He looked at the cabin, no longer sagging and desperate. He looked at Vashti, who stood frozen on the porch, the blood draining from her face. "Well now," Jacob said, swinging down from his horse. "Looks like my little woman's busy. Place is looking right fine." He started toward her, his stride full of an arrogant ownership that made her skin crawl. "I've come home, Vashti. I've come home to my family." The world tilted on its axis. Jacob's return was a blight, a pestilence settling over the fragile peace she had built. He sauntered onto the porch, as if he had only been gone a day, his eyes sweeping over her with a possessive familiarity that turned her stomach. He was thinner, his clothes more ragged than she remembered, but the same cruel confidence radiated from him. "Where are the kids?" he asked, trying to peer past her into the cabin. "They ain't forgotten their old pa, have they? They are inside," Vashti said, her voice a low, tight wire. She did not move from the doorway, blocking his path. "What do you want, Jacob?" He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "What do I want? I want my home. My wife, my children. A man gets tired of wandering. It's time I settled down, took up my responsibilities." His gaze flickered to the fat Jersey cow in the pasture. "Looks like things have been going well enough. Heard in town you had a guardian angel." The words were laced with a sneering insinuation. The children had heard his voice. Caleb appeared behind her, his face a thundercloud of adolescent fury. Leah was just behind him, her arms wrapped around the smaller children, shielding them. Their fear was a palpable thing in the small cabin. "You're not our pa," Caleb spat, his voice cracking. "You left us." Jacob's smile vanished. His eyes hardened into chips of cold stone. You watch your mouth, boy, or I'll teach you some manners." He took a step toward the door, and Vashti instinctively moved to block him, her hand going to the doorframe. "You're not welcome here, Jacob," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "This is my home now. You abandoned it. You abandoned us." "Abandoned?" He laughed, a loud, false sound meant for an audience. "I went to find work. To provide for my family. It ain't my fault things went sour. Now I'm back, and the law says this is my land, and you are my wife." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper only she could hear. "And everything on this land, including that rich rancher's charity, belongs to me. You'll do as I say, or you and the brats will be out on the prairie with nothing but the clothes on your backs. Understand?" The threat was real. In the eyes of the law, he was right. He was the husband. This was his homestead claim. She was his wife. She had no rights, no standing. The life she had scraped together, the safety she had found, it could all be taken away by this man who had discarded them like trash. That evening, Emmett arrived to find a shadow over the house. The children were silent and huddled. Vashti's face was pale and strained, and Jacob was sitting at her table as if he owned it, a plate of her food in front of him. Emmett stopped dead in the doorway, his big frame filling the space. His gaze went from Jacob's smirking face to Vashti's terrified one, and he understood instantly. The air in the cabin crackled with tension. "Emmett," Jacob said, his tone oozing a false friendliness. "Heard a lot about you, Jacob Miller." He stuck out a hand, which Emmett ignored. "I'm obliged for you looking after my family while I was away on business, but I'm back now. I can take it from here." Emmett's eyes, gray as storm clouds, were fixed on Vashti. He saw the despair in her posture, the way she wouldn't look at him. He saw the children shrinking away from the man who called himself their father. "Is this what you want, Vashti?" Emmett asked, his voice dangerously quiet. She couldn't speak. If she told Emmett to make him leave, Jacob would take his revenge on her and the children later. If she told him to go, she would be condemning her family back to a life of fear and misery under Jacob's thumb. Jacob answered for her. "Of course it's what she wants," he said with a smug grin. "A woman wants her husband. It's the natural way of things." Emmett looked from Jacob's triumphant face to Vashti's trapped one. He saw the legal and social walls that had just sprung up around her. He was a man of immense power, but even he could not easily step between a husband and a wife. To interfere would be to invite a scandal that could ruin them both. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, not to Jacob, but nod of retreat. "I see," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He turned and walked away from the cabin, leaving her alone in the sudden, suffocating darkness. The mountain had stepped back, the bulwark was gone, and Vashti was left in the ruins, with the monster who had created them in the first place. The world shrank to the size of the cabin, and the air within it grew thick with dread. Emmett did not return. The track leading to her home remained empty, a dusty ribbon of forsaken hope. Each dawn she would scan the Herzlian, a foolish prayer in her heart, and each dusk she would watch the suns set on her empty vigil. He had retreated. He had seen the impossibility of the situation, the legal tangle of a husband's return, and he had chosen the rational path. He had walked away. The cold, logical part of her understood. The part of her that had learned to trust him, to lean on his strength, felt as if it had been carved out with a dull knife. Jacob settled in like a parasite, consuming everything and contributing nothing. He ate the food Emmett had provided, slept in the bed Vashti had considered her own, and treated the children with a mixture of neglect and casual cruelty. He did not work the land. He spent his days lounging on the porch, oiling a pistol, or riding into town on the good horse he had returned with, wasting what little money he had on whiskey. He delighted in tormenting her, in reminding her of her powerlessness. "Your rich man ain't coming back, is he?" he would taunt, his voice slick with satisfaction. "He's a big man, Emmett. Big men don't get their hands dirty with other men's messes. He knows the law." "You're mine," the children wilted. The laughter was gone, replaced by whispers and fearful glances. Caleb grew sullen and defiant, earning him the back of Jacob's hand more than once. Leah became a small, silent ghost, her eyes filled with a constant, weary sadness. Vashti felt the old despair creeping back in, a cold fog that threatened to suffocate her. She was trapped. Jacob had her legally, and the town, led by the likes of Mrs. Petty, saw only the proper order of things being restored, a husband returning to his family. They did not see the bruises on Caleb's arm or the terror in her children's eyes. One night, after a particularly vicious argument where Jacob had threatened to sell the milk cow for whiskey money, Vashti reached her breaking point. She waited until he was snoring in a drunken stupor. Then she went to the small chest where she kept her few precious things: her mother's Bible, her father's letters, and a small leather-bound journal. She lit a candle, her hand shaking so badly she could barely strike the match. For years, she had kept a record. It had started as a simple ledger, a way to track household expenses, but it had become something more. A place to pour out the frustrations and fears she could speak to no one. Her pen had recorded Jacob's long absences, his drunken rages, the money he took, the promises he broke. It was a meticulous, dated account of his neglect and abandonment. But there was more. Hidden in a small pocket inside the back cover was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a warrant. A warrant for the arrest of one Jacob Miller, from a county 2 territories away, for theft and fraud. A Pinkerton agent had come through their old town a year before Jacob left, asking questions. Vashti had found the dropped handbill after the agent was gone and had hidden it, half out of fear and half out of a desperate, foolish loyalty to the man she had married. Holding the warrant now, she felt no loyalty, only a cold, hard resolve. This was her weapon. This was her truth. But what could she do with it? The nearest law was the town sheriff, a man who played checkers with Jacob at the mercantile and saw him as a victim of circumstance. He would not listen to her. She had to run. It was the only way. She would pack what they could carry, take the children, and disappear into the night. They would walk until they could walk no more. It would be a desperate, dangerous gamble. But it was better than the slow death of the soul she was enduring here. She began to gather their things, moving with silent urgency. A sack with the last of the flour and dried beans, a blanket for each child. The journal and the warrant she tucked into the bodice of her dress. As she worked, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the dark window pane. A gaunt, haunted face stared back at her. This was her lowest point, lower even than the days of starvation. Then she had been alone but free. Now she was a prisoner in her own home. The connection she had forged with Emmett, the hope she had allowed to bloom, it all seemed like a cruel dream. This cabin, this land, was not a home. It was a cage, and she had to break out. With the children woken and bundled in their warmest clothes, their small, frightened faces pale in the moonlight, Vashti led them out into the cold night. She left everything else behind: the cow, the chickens, the herbs in her garden. They were the trappings of a life that was no longer hers. Every step away from the cabin felt like a step out of a grave. But as they cleared the rise and looked back one last time, she saw a light in the distance. A lantern moving steadily up the track toward the cabin. Her heart stopped. It was not Jacob. It was a single rider, tall in the saddle. It was Emmett. He saw them, a small, huddled group of refugees against the starry sky. He urged his horse forward, dismounting before he reached them. He held the lantern high, and its light fell on Vashti's face, illuminating the tear tracks on her dusty cheeks and the desperate resolve in her eyes. "You were leaving," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of profound sorrow. "I have to," she whispered, clutching Ben tighter. "I have to get them away from him." "Running is not the answer," he said, his voice low and intense. "You run now. He'll have the law on his side to hunt you down as a runaway wife. You cannot fight him by disappearing. You have to fight him by standing still." "Still?" Her voice broke. "He owns me, Emmett. He owns this land. The law protects him. The town supports him. You have me," he said, and the words were a vow. He took a step closer, his gaze burning into hers. "I was a fool. I saw the walls of the law, and I retreated. I left you to the wolf because I was afraid of the trouble it would cause. I spent the last week listening to my own damned silence, and I was ashamed." He looked past her at the cabin where Jacob slept, A man doesn't walk away from what matters. He doesn't let fear make his choices. It was then that she made her choice, not to run, but to fight. Her hand went to her dress, to the papers hidden there. "I am not empty-handed," she said, her voice gaining strength. She pulled out the yellowed warrant and her journal. "This is a warrant for his arrest in the Cherokee Nation, and this," she held up the journal, "this is a record of every day he abandoned us. Every dollar he stole, every promise he broke." Emmett took the papers, his eyes scanning the warrant first, then flipping through the journal under the lantern light. A slow, cold anger built in his face. He looked up from the pages, his expression transformed. The sorrow was gone, replaced by a steel resolve that matched her own. This was her hidden strength, her meticulous record of the truth, and she had just handed him the ammunition he needed. "This changes things," he said. "This is more than gossip. This is proof." He looked at her, at the fierce courage shining in her eyes. She had not waited to be rescued. She had been forging her own weapon in the dark. This was the mutual rescue. She had found the means, and he would provide the force. "Go back to the cabin, Vashti," he said, his voice a command. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me. I'm going to town. I'm going to get the sheriff. We are going to end this, tonight." He rode off, not as a man in retreat, but as a man going to war. Vashti gathered her children and led them back to the house. She did not feel despair now. She felt a terrifying, electric hope. She had chosen to stay and fight, and the mountain was standing beside her. The wait was the longest hour of Vashti's life. She barred the door and sat with her children by the cold hearth, the sleeping Zinsterser in the other room, a rumbling, oblivious threat. She held her father's Bible in her lap, its worn leather a comforting weight, her fingers tracing the faded gold letters. She did not pray for deliverance. She prayed for strength. Just as the first hint of dawn began to pale the eastern sky, she heard them. The sound of multiple horses. She hurried to the window and saw 3 riders: Emmett, Sheriff Thompson, and a deputy. Sheriff Thompson looked unhappy. A man roused from his bed to deal with a domestic squabble he clearly thought was beneath him. Emmett dismounted and strode to the door. "Vashti." She unbarred the door and opened it. He stepped inside, his presence immediately shrinking the small room. He gestured for the sheriff to remain on the porch. "Wake him up," Emmett said quietly. Vashti went to the bedroom door and pushed it open. "Jacob." "Wake up. The sheriff is here." Jacob stirred, groaning. He stumbled out into the main room, blinking in the lantern light, his hair wild, his face puffy from drink. He saw Emmett and his face contorted in a sneer. "What is this? You come back with the law now? Trying to scare me off my own property? Your property?" Emmett's voice was dangerously soft. He held up the warrant. "Sheriff, this is a warrant for Jacob Miller for grand larceny and fraud, issued by the federal court in the Cherokee Nation." Sheriff Thompson's eyebrows shot up. He took the paper and studied it. Jacob's face went pale. "That's a lie. It's a forgery." "Is it?" Emmett then held up Vashti's journal. "And this is a record kept by your wife, detailing your abandonment of her and your 5 children for a period of over 4 months. It details your lack of support, your failure to work the claim as required by the Homestead Act. According to the law, Sheriff, this claim is forfeit. It reverts to the government." The sheriff looked from the journal to Jacob's panicked face, then to Vashti, who stood tall and silent, her eyes fixed on her husband. The town's gossip was one thing. A federal warrant and a meticulously kept journal were another. "It's her word against mine," Jacob blustered, trying to regain his footing. "She's a bitter woman turned against me by him." "No," Caleb's voice cut through the tension. He stepped forward, standing between his mother and Jacob. "It's not just her word." He pulled up his sleeve, showing the sheriff the faded yellow and purple bruises on his arm. "He did this and he did it before. He left us to starve. Mr. Emmett saved us." "He's the liar." That was the turning point. The sight of the bruises on the boy, the quiet dignity of the wife, the federal warrant. It was too much for even the complacent sheriff to ignore. He looked at Jacob with new eyes, seeing not a wronged husband, but a bully and a criminal. Miller, the sheriff said, his voice hard, "You're under arrest." Jacob's face crumpled. The arrogance, the cruelty. It all dissolved into a pathetic, whining fear. "You can't. This is my home." "Not anymore," Emmett said, his voice like iron. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over Jacob. "You have two choices. You can let the sheriff take you in, and I will personally see that this warrant is delivered and that you stand trial. Or you can get on your horse and ride out of this territory and never ever come back. If you ever show your face here again, if you ever come near her or these children again, there is no corner of this earth where you will be safe from me." It was not a threat. It was a promise. The kind of promise a man like Emmett kept. Jacob stared into Emmett's unyielding face, and what he saw there broke him completely. He scrambled for his boots and his coat, his hands trembling. Without a word to Vashti or the children, he fled the cabin. The sheriff and his deputy watched as he threw a saddle on his horse and galloped away, a pathetic, fleeing figure disappearing into the dawn. Silence descended on the cabin. It was over. The sheriff, looking deeply uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Mom, about the claim. I'll handle it." Emmett said, cutting him off. "I'll buy the forfeiture from the land office and sign the deed over to Mrs. Miller." The sheriff nodded, relieved to be free of the whole messy business. He tipped his hat to Vashti. "Mom." Then he and his deputy mounted up and rode away, leaving Vashti and Emmett standing in the open doorway of her reclaimed home. The children, sensing the shift, the lifting of the great weight, slowly came forward. Miriam tugged on Vashti's dress. "Is he gone, Mama, for good?" Vashti knelt and gathered her into a fierce hug. "Yes, little one. He's gone for good." She looked up at Emmett over her daughter's head, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She had no words. There were no words big enough to hold the gratitude, the relief, the overwhelming emotion that filled her heart. He did not need words. He simply reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder, a solid, grounding touch. He had stood against the law, against the town, against the man who had tried to destroy her, and he had done it for her. He had rescued her. And she, with her quiet strength, her hidden journal, her refusal to break, had given him the cause he needed to come back to life. She had rescued him from his own prison of grief and solitude. The rescue had been mutual, and in the quiet light of the new day, a new life was beginning. In the weeks that followed, the world settled into a new shape. The shadow of Jacob was gone, and in its place a quiet, steady light grew. Emmett was true to his word. He navigated the legal complexities with the land office, and one afternoon he arrived with a crisp official document. The deed to the 160 acres, free and clear, in the name of Vashti Miller. She held the paper in her hands, the weight of it both immense and liberating. It was not just land, it was security, it was a future. It was a home that no one could ever take from her. "I can't repay you for this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "There is no debt between us, Vashti," he said, his voice gentle. He stood close, the familiar scent of leather and clean wind filling her senses. "This is yours. You earned it." The town's attitude shifted, as fickle as the prairie wind. The story of the federal warrant and Jacob's cowardly flight had spread like wildfire. Mrs. Petty and her gossips were silenced, their sordid speculations replaced by a grudging respect. Vashti was no longer seen as a fallen woman being kept by a rich man. She was seen as a survivor, a mother who had protected her children against a villain. When she went to the mercantile now, the women nodded to her. The store owner gave her credit without her even having to ask. She had been publicly validated. She belonged. Emmett's visits continued, but they were different now. The pretense was gone. He came not as a benefactor or a protector, but as a man coming home. He took his place at their supper table naturally. He spent his evenings on the porch, not in watchful silence, but in easy conversation with her. He talked about his past, about his wife, Eleanor, and for the first time he spoke the names of his son, Samuel. He spoke of his grief, not as a closed wound, but as a scar he had learned to live with. He was opening himself to her, letting her into the walled-off fortress of his heart. He was becoming vulnerable, and in his vulnerability she saw his true strength. One cool evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon. They were standing by the corral, watching the horses. The children's laughter drifted from the cabin, a sweet, melodic sound. I have not heard laughter like that in my own house for 10 years, Emmett said quietly. My life was a silence before I met you. Vashti's heart ached with love for this good, damaged man. And my life was a fearful one, she replied softly. You brought us peace, Emmett. He turned to her, his gray eyes full of a deep, unwavering emotion. He reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. You brought me back to life, Vashti. You and your children, you showed me what a home is. Lowered his head and his lips met hers. The kiss was not a spark, but a slow, deep fire. It was a kiss of gratitude, of homecoming, of promises kept, and a future finally within reach. It was a kiss that had been earned through months of hardship, trust, and quiet longing. When it ended, he rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cool air. Marry me, Vashti, he whispered. Be my wife. Let me be a father to your children. Let's join these two broken pieces of land, these two broken lives, and make them whole. Tears of joy traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. Yes, she breathed. Yes. A few months later, they stood on the porch of the new house. Emmett had insisted on building it, not far from the old cabin which now served as a sturdy barn. The new house was made of solid oak and stone, with wide windows to let in the light, and a deep porch that looked out over the rolling hills of the Cross Creek, now joined with her own small homestead. It was a house built on a solid foundation, a house built to last. Vashti, her hand resting in Emmett's, watched as Caleb and Daniel helped one of the ranch hands with a horse. Leah and Miriam were setting the table for supper inside, their song carrying on the breeze. Little Ben sat on the porch steps, happily trying to coax a kitten with a piece of string. The 6 mouths were fed. They were safe, they were loved. The frontier was still wild, the wind still blew, but here, in the circle of this man's love, she had found her shelter, she had found her home.